The day this happened began in the most unremarkable way imaginable. The kind of slow mid-morning weekday where the streets feel calmer than usual. The sunlight rests gently instead of burning, and life seems predictable enough that you never expect a simple errand to turn into a confrontation that leaves you questioning how casually some people choose conflict over understanding, especially when they believe they are defending roles they barely understand themselves. My grandfather had asked me the night before if I could take him to the bank the next morning, because his knee replacement surgery from earlier in the year still made driving uncomfortable for him, and even though he was stubbornly independent in most things, walking long distances and managing parking lots had become something he quietly dreaded. So I agreed without hesitation, knowing how much pride it cost him to ask for help in the first place. We arrived at the bank a little after 10, the parking lot half full with a mix of sedans, SUVs, and a few delivery vans idling nearby. And near the entrance were 3 senior parking spots clearly marked with faded blue paint and signs that politely requested consideration rather than threatening punishment. And when I noticed one of those spots was open, close to the automatic doors, I eased the car in carefully, mindful of how slow my grandfather would need to move once he stepped out. As I turned off the engine and stepped out to walk around and help him, I was already mentally focused on small details like making sure the door opened wide enough, that his cane was within reach, and that no one rushed past him impatiently, because when you escort someone elderly, your world narrows into protecting their pace and dignity. But before I could even reach the passenger door, a sharp voice cut through the quiet morning air with a tone that carried authority, accusation, and an unmistakable sense of entitlement. "Excuse me, you cannot park there," the woman said loudly enough that several people near the entrance turned their heads. And when I looked up, I saw her standing beside a silver SUV, arms crossed tightly against her chest, sunglasses perched on her face despite the mild light, her posture rigid as if she had been waiting all day for a chance to correct someone. I was momentarily confused, because I genuinely didn't understand what rule she thought I had broken. And when I asked her what the problem was, she pointed sharply at the senior parking sign and said that it was reserved for seniors and that I was clearly too young to be using it, her voice dripping with certainty as if the case had already been closed in her mind. Before I could explain anything, my grandfather slowly began shifting in his seat, gripping the door frame and his cane as he prepared to stand, his movements careful and deliberate in the way that only comes from years of learning how fragile balance can be. But the woman barely glanced at him, instead continuing her lecture about how young people constantly disrespect seniors and how rules exist for a reason, her voice growing louder with every word as though volume alone could transform assumption into truth. I calmly told her that my grandfather was the senior and that I was simply driving him, but she dismissed that explanation with a scoff and an exaggerated shake of her head, claiming that everyone suddenly has an elderly relative when they get caught, and suggesting that if he were truly the one entitled to the spot, he would be the one behind the wheel, completely ignoring the fact that age, health, and reality rarely align with her simplistic logic. By the time my grandfather was fully standing, leaning heavily on his cane and looking visibly uncomfortable with the attention, several people had slowed their steps to watch, and the situation had already escalated into something far more public than it ever needed to be, which made me feel a mix of frustration and protectiveness, because no one deserves to be turned into a spectacle while simply trying to complete an ordinary task. When my grandfather quietly asked me if everything was all right, the woman cut in again before I could answer, stating that she was calling the police because people like me only understand consequences when authority is involved. And without waiting for any response, she pulled out her phone and began dialing, pacing back and forth dramatically as if performing for an invisible audience that only existed in her mind. For a brief moment, I considered moving the car just to end the situation, but the idea of rewarding such behavior with compliance felt wrong, especially when my grandfather had done nothing to deserve being treated as an inconvenience, rather than the very person the parking spot was intended to serve. So instead, I stayed where I was, supporting him and waiting quietly while she spoke loudly into her phone, emphasizing words like illegal, disrespectful, and refusal, each one painted with her personal interpretation rather than fact. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as we waited, the tension thick enough to feel heavy, and when the police car finally pulled into the lot, its presence instantly changed the mood, because flashing lights have a way of validating one person's outrage while unsettling everyone else, even when no wrongdoing has occurred. The officer approached calmly, listening first to the woman as she eagerly recounted her version of events, pointing at me repeatedly and insisting that she had done the right thing by reporting someone who was abusing senior privileges. And when it was my turn to speak, I explained everything clearly and respectfully, describing how I was driving my grandfather, how the spot was intended for seniors being transported, and how he was standing right beside me as proof of that fact. The officer looked at the sign, then at my grandfather, then back at the woman, and explained patiently that senior parking rules apply to the passenger as well as the driver, and that no law had been broken, which caused the woman's confident expression to falter as the reality she hadn't considered began to sink in. She tried to argue that she was only protecting seniors, but the officer gently reminded her that calling the police for a non-issue wastes resources and creates unnecessary stress, especially for the very people she claimed to be defending. And when my grandfather quietly confirmed that he felt neither endangered nor inconvenienced, the officer concluded the matter and dismissed everyone. The woman returned to her SUV without another word, her earlier confidence replaced by visible irritation, and as she slammed her door and sped off, the parking lot seemed to exhale, the audience dispersing as quickly as it had formed, leaving behind nothing but an uncomfortable silence and a lingering awareness of how easily everyday moments could be poisoned by misplaced authority. Inside the bank, my grandfather moved slowly but steadily, and though he didn't say much at first, his presence alone reminded me why standing my ground had mattered. Because dignity is not something you negotiate away for convenience, especially when it belongs to someone who has already given enough of it up to time. As we completed his transaction and returned to the car, he finally spoke, telling me that I had handled the situation with patience and that some people walk through life looking for rules, not to follow, but to weaponize. And as we drove home under the same calm sky that had greeted us that morning, I realized how thin the line is between order and control, and how quickly compassion disappears when someone decides they know better than everyone else, without bothering to understand the full story. That day taught me that entitlement doesn't always come from privilege, but from certainty without empathy. And that's sometimes the most important thing you can do in the face of loud injustice, is remain calm, stay present, and protect the people who matter, even when all you wanted to do was go to the bank and come back home.